Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Iraq. And Iraq gets left out a lot when we're talking about the regional tensions, especially those between the United States and Iran, which are playing out on Iraqi soil to a very large extent. The Shia leader there, Muqtada Al-Sadar, has now called for a million-man march against the presence of U.S. troops in the country. He's united, I should say, with other Shia parties as well, vis-a-vis that specific aim. However, there's also reports the U.S. has in fact started joint operations with Iraq as early as Wednesday. That's according to the New York Times. On top of all of this is German troops too. Germany wants its troops to remain in Iraq. Adil Abdul-Mahdi has seemingly also indicated that he'd like German troops to remain as well. So when the likes of Al-Sadar and others talk about U.S. troops leaving, do they just mean specifically just U.S. troops, or do they mean all foreign troops? Because then there is then the demand of those who are on the streets in Tahrir Square in Baghdad for all to leave the country and to leave it to Iraqis themselves, seemingly at least when we're talking about the U.S. and Iran. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Ahmed Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst. He's joining us now from London. Also joining us from London is Salah Al-Hashimi, who is an Iraqi legal advisor to the National Council for Iraqi Opposition. Salah and Ahmed, thank you both for your time today. Ahmed, let me start with you. What do you make of Muqtada Al-Sadar's call for this million-man march? He's now united with other groups in that regard.
Yeah, I think what Muqtada Al-Sadar is trying to do, he's trying to basically get the support of Iraqis to the idea of non-foreign intervention in Iraq. Today he tweeted a couple of tweets about his support for the people in Tahrir Square. We had reports prior to this millions-man march that the demonstrators who are going to demonstrate on the 24th might clash with those who are already demonstrating, requesting reforms in Iraq. So Al-Sadar is basically trying to kind of get all the Iraqis behind the idea of Iraq ought to be independent and free from foreign troops.
Okay, so Salah, that's certainly a good thing then, right? I mean, Al-Sadar has from day one seemingly supported even those protests that are taking place in Tahrir Square. So how do you think they will be receiving the news of Al-Sadar calling for this million-man march, asking for U.S. troops to leave?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It is quite disheartening to see that Mr. Muqtada Al-Sadar, who is a leader of quite a large movement in Iraq with plenty of supporters, not to have called a meeting after the murder of 600 peaceful protesters on the streets of Iraq. But he did call this meeting after the killings of both Qasim Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis outside the Baghdad International Airport. That, of course, is going to raise plenty of eyebrows on the streets of Iraq. Simply because if you're talking about the peaceful protesters, that's exactly what they will be thinking. Our interests do not matter as much as the interests of people who have been targeted by the US, regardless of their nationality. Now, in terms of the Sadarist movement, the geographical location of this meeting is also of importance. Apparently, they were discussing Iraqi affairs, but they discussed them not in Iraq, where they should be discussed. They discussed them in Iran, which to me appears to have a heavy influence, I mean Iranians, yes, on the decision by Muqtada Al-Sadar and others who have supported him. Now, in terms of the Muqtada Al-Sadar and his movement supporting the demonstrators in Iraq, well, if that was going to be genuine, then I don't see why he should continue participating in the government, of which, of course, he has plenty of ministers. Yeah. Now, it seems to me that there is an issue there that he needs to deal with, a genuine issue. He has been called upon to basically make clear precisely his position from those demonstrators, and I don't think he has so far. So calling in this meeting, I think, is going to throw the entire situation into confusion.
Very well. Let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now also Hussein Abdallah, who is a geopolitical analyst. He specializes in the Middle East region. He's also served in different government and corporate roles, including in the oil and gas sector. He's joining us now from Dubai. Hussein, as always, we appreciate your time. On that point, Hussein, as you may have heard Salah making, the fact that Muqtada Al-Sadar met other groups within Iran and not on Iraqi territory to unite over U.S. troops needing to leave the country. Is that a sign that Iranian influence will only grow in Iraq? Why didn't this meeting take place, for example, in Iraq?
Thanks, Waqar, for having me. Thanks for the question. I think we need to make a distinction between Muqtada Sadr and the rest of the groups in Iraq, which are more closely aligned to Iran. Even Iran knows that very well, and they've managed the relationship with Muqtada Sadr quite differently. They know that Muqtada Sadr is not a proxy of Iran. He's on a number of issues, had different positions than Iran's traditional allies in Iraq. And yet they've still managed to have him as a friend rather than a foe. So I do think that the distinction is quite important between Muqtada Sadr and the rest of Iran's allies in Iraq. Now, why has he attended that meeting? I think the meeting is Iran calling on all its sort of allies to meet in Qom, and they wanted to include Sadr. Sadr's boycotting of that meeting would have sent the wrong message to Iran. So I think he's trying also to balance that relationship as much as possible. We've seen him do that in the past when he was accused of being behind the protests, which were chanting anti-Iran slogans. Yeah. And he always tries to sort of bridge that gap by going to Tehran and discussing with Iranian officials. So now I think he's in a very, very confusing position. And he's trying to balance that relationship. He will not boycott. He chose not to boycott that meeting. That does not necessarily mean that he will carry out Iran's agenda in Iraq.
Okay, so then on that point, then Ahmed, let's talk about U.S. troops then. Because, as I put in my introduction, on Wednesday, the New York Times reports that the U.S. carried out joint military operations with Iraq. That doesn't seem like, at least, a country that wants to get rid of American troops.
True. I think the call of Muqtada Sadr, despite being very nationalistic, I think it undermines the calls, the kind of other sounds in Iraq. You know, Iraqi parliament is made up of Kurds, Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs, and only the Shia Arabs voted for the dismissal of the U.S. troops. At the moment, Iraq has invited the U.S. troops to come in and help the Iraqi troops for training and also countering terrorism that is fighting ISIS in the western parts of Iraq. So I think what the Iraqi government has maybe discussed with the Americans is they probably wanted the Americans to reduce their operation in Iraq or reduce these operations that may lead to kind of tensions with other countries or targeting of al-Hashid, which might infuse anger among Iraqis against the Americans and keep them to kind of minimum or none. And I suspect the American would listen to the Iraqi government. After all, America would only do what's best for its national interest.
Okay, and so Salah, what do you think the American role going forward in Iraq will be? Because it is a bit confusing where we have, of course, as we know, the Iraqi parliament, minus many very important members who didn't take part in that vote, voting to have the U.S. troops ousted. Then at the same time, we now have these joint operations still taking place. Those on the streets in Tahrir Square want both the U.S. and Iran out. Will the U.S. be leaving, do you think?
Well, first of all, I would like to refer you to the American administration's own announcements by President Trump declaring that the Iraqi officials say one thing in public and say another in private. So if we take that confirmation into consideration, we will see that the Iraqis may have been publicly denouncing the Americans and asking them to leave, particularly by carrying out this show in Parliament, which is probably nothing more than a show of solidarity with Iran in its mourning of the losing of Qasem Soleimani. So we have this double standard whereby they say one thing in public and another thing in private. And that's, I would agree with your guest in London in that they would have probably wished to continue limited joint operations for this time, because at the end of the day, in order to have the Americans leave Iraq, you would need a formal request from a credible government. At this moment in time, we do not have a permanent government. We have an interim government. And therefore, that request for the Americans to leave would be invalid even if it was made by this government at this moment in time. Now, I don't think the Americans are going to leave in a hurry. They have plenty of interests in Iraq, and they have threatened also, as you probably know, sanctions if they do leave. And they have now, I believe, taken steps. They have now put to scrutiny Iraq's financial dealings with the American Federal Bank, where all of the money from the oil is deposited and then transferred into the Iraqi Central Bank. So they have taken some steps in order to warn the Iraqi government that should you continue with your request, we are going to take serious steps as to probably exposing some of the financial misdealings and other probably sanctions as well. So I don't think this is going to be any decision by the Americans is not going to be taken in a hurry. And I think the Iraqis need to think twice. Just one point I need to get back to your that was made by your guest in Dubai. Sure. In that I think the Sadarist movement, or the Sadr himself calling, the timing of his calling of this meeting and the demonstrations immediately, of course, after the killings of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, throws into question as to whether he is closely allied to the Iranians or not. It is absolutely correct to suggest that everyone used to think that he was not so close to Iran. Yeah. It is possible, and I would say this is a serious possibility, that the murder of these two individuals may have compelled him, and I say compelled him, to draw closer to Iran for various reasons. So I think the timing as well needs to be thrown into question.
Okay, point taken. Hussein, I want to come back to you and ask you about this issue of U.S. troops, because it seems, as Salah there said, with the U.S. also threatening the Iraqis that, listen, if you go through with this desire for us to leave, then there will be consequences. And on the other hand, we can only imagine the kind of pressure that the Iranians are also placing on Iraq behind the scenes, at the very least, about, doing their bidding to an extent in the country. Do you think it's even possible for Iraq to find an independent way out of this, where they can sort of, balance both of these players and remain sort of unstained?
Yeah, Waqar, I think they will struggle to do that. I agree with both of your guests regarding the sort of in Iraq itself, there is sort of tacit approval that the U.S. troops should stay, despite the fact that there is a lot of rhetoric around having to end the presence of U.S. troops in Iraq. I think they do understand, a lot of the Iraqi parties do understand the strategic value of having the U.S. around. And apart from the Hashd al-Shaabi, I would say every other leader in Iraq would not want really to succumb to Iran in such a way where there is no other power to counterbalance Iranian influence in Iraq. So I think there is a bit of a show there about how much do they really want the U.S. to be out. Now, how does that materialize on the ground? I guess the Americans have a number of options there. If they wanted to give the Iraqis an exit, they could relocate, they could redeploy in sort of more to the north and try to get rid of some of their bases closer to the center and south, which they don't have too many if you think about the south particularly. I mean, you're talking about Balad, which is the most furthest south. So they do have a number of options there tactically that they can deploy in order to give the Iraqis an exit. But I can't see how the Iraqis will actually benefit from driving U.S. troops out of the country in the context of what just happened. Right? I can see a benefit for Iran, of course. I can see a benefit for Iran's proxies in Iraq, but I cannot see a benefit for Iraq as a whole.
Ahmed, I wanted to go back to you and ask you about what's happened in Iraq, right? With the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and then the Iranian response on those U.S. bases, or those bases, I should say, in Iraq, which also housed some U.S. troops. That's a nightmare, isn't it, for Iraq? Because it's always said from day one, listen, keep us out of this fight. But yet all of this has happened very much on Iraqi soil. Do you think the country's been able to very clearly tell both of these players, listen, we don't want to be in this fight, or is it simply beyond them at this time? Is Iraq too weak a player at this time to even be demanding that?
Exactly. I think the Iraqi government is incapable of actually stopping the Iranians from interfering in Iraq, and equally preventing the Americans from conducting operations in Iraq. This is because the Iraqi kind of parliament is so divided. The political system that was put in place after 2003 is sectarian, and is based on sectarian division and the kind of the proportion of population. What the Iraqis currently need is the people of the Tahrir Square, the protesters, is to come up with maybe like some political movement that would adopt a new rhetoric, a new vision for the country, to kind of make the country balance and its interest between its neighbors and the United States. Basically, the only thing that I can think of when I think about the Iraqi government incapable of preventing either side is the country does not have any sovereignty. Although the government always spoke about maintaining the Iraqi sovereignty and protecting it, but it doesn't seem to be able to actually do anything about it or stand for the country. Hence, you've got the Americans conducting these operations, which were illegal, and then you've got the Iranians sending their rockets to hit bases that are actually built by Iraqis but occupied by the Americans. I think basically, although you just have said the decision by Muqtada al-Sadr would benefit Iran, it's essentially a nationalist movement. I mean, nobody wants its country to be occupied by any foreign troops. I mean, I'm not a supporter of Sadr myself. I mean, 2 days ago, one of his aides posted some instructions about the demos, and he requested people to carry only the Iraqi flag, show their support only for Iraq, and no other flag should be at the protest. That in itself is a nationalist inclination by Al-Sadr, which hopefully gather Iraqis behind it, and you get like a stable Iraq away from the influence of Iran and the United States.
Okay, so just because we're quickly running out of time, about 2 minutes max, Salah and Hussein, I want to get your final thoughts. Salah first. Just on that point again of a weak Iraq, a country that's not really being able to still find its sovereignty. Am I correct in that regard?
Well, yes. I mean, Iraq retains, I would think, to be quite fair and honest and just about it, I think Iraq retains only partial sovereignty, simply for the existence of a number of armed militias who are closely affiliated with Iran. And those armed militias do have political factions and they operate within parliament. And therefore, they will be able to enforce their will, regardless of whether there is a democratic process or not. And that's the exact problem we have been suffering from. And that's why Iraq has lost most of its sovereignty rights as a normal state. Just let me get back very quickly to your guest carried out by the Americans to kill Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Under customary international law, the Americans will have to prove that there was an imminent danger to American interests, which would make any reaction by the Americans legal. The Americans have not yet revealed what intelligence they had about these two and what operations they have planned. So to determine whether that was legal or not, I think we'd have to wait and see if the Americans reveal what intelligence they've had. So I think it's a little bit premature to say that the actions were illegal. We'll have to wait to decide.
Fair enough. Hussein, I just wanted to get your thoughts as well about Iraq, its sovereignty, and again about this issue of legal versus illegal, be it with the American or Iranian actions.
Yeah, no, I think Waqar, the best manifestation of that weakness is the choice of Abdallah to be prime minister after the election. The inability of the parliamentary blocs to be able to field a proper candidate that is quite representative, and the fact that they always have to have side deals and then end up with someone like Adel Abdelmahdi who doesn't have a bloc for himself in parliament. This tells you that the amount of political bickering that is going on would emerge in a sort of an outcome that is that you'd have a prime minister with no strong popular support, and which would allow the other parties to continue to influence the way the country is heading. Yeah. And yes, I agree with your guest that there is a deep state in Iraq. So regardless of who wins the elections, regardless of what happens after that and how you form the government, there are groups with arms. There are militant groups in the country that are able to influence the country's trajectory, both domestically and on foreign policy, even more importantly.
I'm going to have to cut you off. I do sincerely apologize. I mean, the clock has gotten the best of us, but we do sincerely appreciate all three of you for your time today and, of course, for your insight. That was Hussein speaking to us from Dubai. Ahmed and Salah were speaking to us both from London, respectively. Guests and viewers, we've spoken about what's happened in Iraq recently with the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani, as well as, of course, the assassination of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and a few others in that convoy, Iraqis as well, one should remember. The Iraqis were unhappy about that assassination to begin with, and then the Iranians also, of course, retaliated as they felt was their right to do so. But them at least notifying the Iraqis seemingly from beforehand, before their retaliation took place. Now Muqtada al-Sadr has taken this a step further from the Iraqi parliament's decision to oust U.S. troops, saying that he'll lead a MillionMan march, and he's supported now this call, sitting though in the Iranian city of Qom, united with other groups for U.S. troops to leave Iraq. Is that good enough? Because those in Tahrir Square would say no. They want both the Americans and the Iranians out. Is this what the country will support, especially at a time when actually U.S. forces are carrying out joint operations with the Iraqis? So it seems that Iraq doesn't really know what it wants either, or as all of our guests said, they tacitly really want U.S. troops to remain in some form. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's program, we're going to discuss the Iran nuclear deal, but from the point of view of Europe. As we know, Europe, the three main European countries, i.e. France, Germany, and the UK, have formally now brought forth a dispute mechanism within the JCPOA, that is the Iran nuclear deal, saying that Iran is not living up to its end of the bargain. Now, the Iranians obviously would admit that they have been walking away from the deal ever so slowly on a 2-month basis ever since the U.S. walked away from the deal also, about a year after that, in fact. They started the process of ever so slowly removing certain constraints that they had placed on their nuclear program within that deal. Now, one of the interesting news has come out overnight is that the Trump administration has in fact threatened, or it's been reported to have threatened, a 25% tariff on European automobile imports if these three countries did not formally accuse Iran of breaking the nuclear deal. That's according to the Washington Post. Now, that throws a spanner into this entire issue, because it's sort of then egg on the face of Europe, which always says and claims that it has an independent foreign policy. Was Europe pressured into declaring Iran to be in violation of the nuclear deal and to bring forth this dispute mechanism? I'll put that question now to our panelists who are joining us. We're joined now by Florian Peschl, who is an independent political researcher and journalist. He specializes in knowledge of EU affairs, security and conflict studies, international relations. He's also an expert in the Middle East as well. He's joining us now from Vienna. We're also joined by Kaunert, who is a professor of policing and security. He's the director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. He's joining us now from Cardiff in the UK. And joining us from the French capital, Paris, is Kourosh Shamlou, who is an international lawyer and managing partner at Shamlou Law. Kourosh, Christian, and Florian, thank you to all three of you for joining us today. Kourosh, let me start with you. Let's start firstly with this news that has just come out recently, overnight at least, about Trump threatening tariffs on European cars if Britain, France, and Germany did not formally accuse Iran of violating the nuclear deal. What do you make of that?
If the European Union is going to impose new sanctions, but will it change anything or everything. The Iran is already under the U.S. sanction, which is are very, very hard sanctions, but Iran still keeps on going. So Iran doesn't want to go to war. The United States doesn't want to go to war. And the most important thing is that the Iranians and the Europeans do not want to withdraw from this accord because they both want to stay in it. So they try to make it last to see what's going to happen for the U.S. election in this coming November.
Florian, do you think the Europeans are essentially bullied by the U.S. into declaring and to bring forth this dispute mechanism?
I think they were bullied necessarily. I think there is the need for European leaders to stand up and to now get a harsher position on Iran. I still think they are trying to save the deal. The question is whether this is possible. I don't really believe in it. I don't really see the commitments on the Iranian side. And as the threatening of sanctions, for example, of tariffs from the side of the US, this is I wouldn't count it as bullying. This is typical Trump strategy. But I don't think a bullet would be too harsh of a term.
So Florian, if I may just stick with you, because you spoke about Iran certainly walking away from this deal and not completely abiding by it, but that all happened with the root cause of the U.S. first walking away, right? And then Iran pressurizing Europe into saying, listen, you need to do more if we are to remain in this deal, as in give us what we were promised within this deal. What of that aspect?
Well, if you believe U.S. intelligence, for example, the Iranians have already been trying to circumvent the deal before Soleimani was killed, for example, or before the U.S. went away from the deal. The question is, I'm not an intelligence. I'm not in the intelligence community, so I don't know which information is to be trusted. My point of view is that the deal was from the beginning quite a difficult issue. It is. I don't believe that the Iranian regime from the beginning really intended to stick to the deal. But yeah, it's true. After the steps in U.S. foreign policy in the last months and weeks are difficult to deal with from the European side, but that's nothing new in the European Union, that our foreign policy is that we are always stuck somewhere between the U.S. and their interests and other powers.
Christian, what do you make of that? Because where you're sitting in the UK, we've already had Boris Johnson saying we could very well just scrap this deal and come up with a better deal or a Trump deal, as he said. Is that the way to go?
Well, I think when Donald Trump tried to get out of the deal, I think that was the end goal in the end. It was to replace the Obama deal, as he would see it, with a new deal, which he would design and where he would really be in charge of the matter. Now, is such a deal available? I'm not entirely sure that there are more concessions that you can get out of the Iranian leadership at this point, but perhaps he's right. But it's certainly the way things are going, with the UK having publicly backed the United States, with Germany and France and the European Union moving closer to maybe not abandoning the deal, but kind of putting some doubts on the deal. I think that may be where we're heading at the moment.
Kourosh, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think Iran is willing to renegotiate a different deal?
As I said before, I was just going to go back for 2 minutes on what has been said. The European Union wants to stay in the deal, but the day the Americans left this accord, all the companies disinvested from Iran. So that deal was dead the day the Americans withdrew from the deal. And people say Iran stayed in the deal and tried to be forceful its engagement, and it stayed on the deal. But the Europeans tell Iran, okay, you don't do your part of the engagement, but the Europeans don't do their part of engagement also. They put instincts in place in order to circumvent the American sanction in order to invest in Iran, but it didn't work. No company came to Iran and tried to work. So as I said before, what's going to happen? This deal was dead. We cannot go back to this deal. Why? Because the Iranians don't believe the Americans' words anymore. It's worthless, useless, because if they make a new deal with Donald Trump now, and if Donald Trump loses the election, so then the new president can come and say, okay, this deal is not good for us. We're not gonna stick to it. So what's gonna happen? As I said, it's the Iranians have the capacity to maintain like this until the American election. If Donald Trump wins the election, then the Iranians are almost obliged to come and sit at the table, because the Iran economy is in a very, very painful situation, and they cannot stay for another 4 years like that. So if Donald Trump wins, the Iranians need to go back and sit on the table. If Donald Trump loses, then it's going to take 1 or 2 years to renegotiate another deal with the rest of the world.
You know, Florian, when the deal wasn't, I know there were a lot of European companies that came in originally to Iran. I was in Iran at the time, and, you know, you saw a flurry of Europeans coming in, a lot of deals being signed, and then all of that just went down the drain. Do you think at some level that even the business community in Europe may want this deal to remain for their own interests?
Yes, of course. It's generally, especially in Germany and Austria, they're domestically divided on this issue when it comes to Iran, because we have a lot of business interests there. But yeah, on the political side, when we talk about the European Union, likes to talk about values and soft power, and on this side, there's two different normative systems between Europe and the Iranian regime. But yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure from the business community, especially in Germany, to get a deal done, or to keep the deal, and to not bring any further sanctions against Iran and business with Iran.
You know, Christian, just recently, Hassan Rouhani speaking about, and this is in context of the Soleimani assassination, he spoke about the fact that, listen, American soldiers in the region are probably not safe. But then he even went a step further and he said tomorrow it may very well be European soldiers, too, who will find themselves in an insecure situation in the region as well. You know, one would think, because Europe is closer to Iran, that Europe would be more worried about its own security as a whole, as a bloc. Is it, do you think, doing enough in order to try to calm the situation and to secure itself, be it via remaining in the deal or otherwise?
Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure Europe has so many options in terms of what it can do to save the deal or remaining the deal. I think, as the previous speakers pointed out, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to save these deal now, because of course the Americans want a new deal. The Iranians no longer believe in the deal. And the Europeans are the only ones hoping that this deal can stay alive. So is there much that Europe can do? I think there were various scenarios that they were trying to pursue, where maybe they could shelter European companies from possible American sanctions if they were doing business with Iran and all of those things, but it never really materialized. So as a result of that, I think the Europeans are Iran's best hope to renegotiate a deal. So therefore, I would think it would be very, very foolish, obviously, for the Iranian regime to harm Europeans. But at the end of the day, I don't think Europeans have as many options.
Kourosh, do you think that Iran would ever purposely want to harm Europeans, European soldiers specifically within the region?
I don't think so, because when even they retaliate against the assassination of the General Soleimani, they made a direct attack on U.S. military plants in Iraq. but their intention was very calculated, and they didn't want to kill any Americans or any American soldier. So it's gonna be the same for European. Iran doesn't want to go to war. Unfortunately, they cannot afford to go to war, and sorry, not unfortunately, but fortunately, and even Americans don't want to go to war. So the situation is gonna stay like that. And I'm just gonna come back on another thing. You talked that you were in Iran when the deal was signed. When the deal was signed, I was also in Iran, and Total, the petroleum company, and Peschl came and signed deal in Iran. And the day Donald Trump said it's the United States gonna withdraw from the deal, Total left its investment in Iran, and Peschl left its investment in Iran. And for Peschl, Iran was the second biggest market in the world, and in 2030, it would have become the first market in the world, even bigger than France. So I don't think there's not going to be any war, because the Americans cannot afford a war over there, and of course, the Iranians cannot afford a war against either the United States or even Europeans.
Okay, so let's moment, Florian, speak about even the greater international community, if we can. At the UN Security Council, there is talk of if this dispute mechanism does go forth and it's found by the Commission that Iran is in violation of the deal, which it may or may not be found, because at this time I imagine the Iranians would also have defensive arguments to put forth. But if that does go to the UN Security Council, the Chinese and the Russians have already said that they would not want those UN sanctions to be put back in place. So they simply wouldn't support that. That then again creates further divisions on this issue. Who's really gaining from this? For the time being, Iran is gaining from this mainly, and China and Russia for sure too, because they have they get this broker position. Especially Russia is very good in maneuvering towards these situations where they get much more power or much more options than you would suggest in the beginning, where like in the Middle East, Russia plays a much bigger role now than 5 years ago. And I think in the long run, it's Iran and it's Russia who would benefit from that. And as the previous speaker said, it's really the EU has not many options, and it's always because, the EU foreign policy is always suffering from these kind of multilateral disputes. Okay, so Christian, I'll give you the final word. All of this is a very risky game, is it not, Christian? Because who's to say tomorrow if this deal just completely falls apart? Even though Iran has said, listen, we don't want nuclear weapons, but who's to say Iran will not just completely quicken the process towards a nuclear weapon or otherwise, or get very close to that? That's not really helping anybody around the world, right? Because the whole deal, the whole point of coming to this deal was to make the rest of the world feel secure.
Indeed, I think we're entering a period that will be very risky, and as the previous speakers pointed out, at the moment it does not look as if neither Iran nor the United States have an interest in having an actual war. However, as we know from history, wars happen sometimes even when actors themselves don't absolutely want it. And as a result of that, I think we're entering into a situation which is obviously volatile, and a lot of things could happen that maybe nobody wants and nobody foresees. So unfortunately, we're there.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, but appreciate all three of our guests. Florian speaking to us there from Vienna, Christian from Cardiff in the UK, and Kourosh who's speaking to us from the French capital, Paris. Viewers, we've tried to give you the context and all points of view on this issue. The nuclear deal is falling apart, or has already fallen apart, really, ever since the U.S. violated and walked away from it. Iran has been, as I said, a year after the U.S. walked away from it, started on a 2-month basis, removing certain constraints that it had placed on itself that were situated and stipulated, I should say, under that deal. However, Iran has not enjoyed the benefits as promised within that deal. At the same time, the Europeans are angry because they've said, listen, we're trying, but Iran is making it that much harder for us to remain within the deal. And they've now brought forth this dispute mechanism, again, within that deal. The deal remains still, but it's just as good as the paper it's written on. No one's really benefiting from it either way. Iran's removed fairly most of the constraints that were placed on it. Will this all fall apart? And then what happens the next day? Is the world any safer? Will Iran be convinced to really renegotiate with the Trump administration at a time when the American establishment has proven it can't be trusted, at least from the Iranian point of view? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.